what strikes me as unique about this election in particular, um, you know, 2016, maybe in hindsight, the election, if we were to redo the polls, we'd probably have Trump at a comfortable margin of victory because that's what ended up happening. In 2020, obviously, it was a different story. Trump was not the favorite at all, and he didn't win. But now we have polls and forecasting and pundits and predictors and forecasters telling us that, this is a toss-up election according to the polls. Now, in a few videos back, I said that the million-dollar question that will decide this election is, um, are the polls underestimating Trump? Are the polls accurate? Or are the polls even underestimating Kamala Harris? And I searched and I searched, and no really reliable, evidence was able to come across, my computer until this morning. I wake up and I read the New York Times, which is considered an A-grade pollster, in which that their margin of error is most accurate compared relative to the other polls. Not saying that their um, predictions are on the dot necessarily, but they released their polls. Good numbers for Trump, but not too terrible for Harris. She's still very much in play in this election. However, you scroll down to the bottom of the article, and I'll just read it off what the New York Times senior pollster Nate Cohn says. He goes, 4 years ago, the polls were thought to underestimate Mr. Trump because of non-response bias, in which his supporters were less likely to take surveys than demographically similar Biden supporters. So, just a little stats 101. Non-response bias is basically when, let's say you're taking a poll about how much money people spend on groceries, and you conduct your calls, in the middle of a workday. More than likely, the people who answer the phone are unemployed, obviously, because it's the middle of the workday. So you're not getting an accurate sample. That would be an example of non-response bias. Picking, conducting a survey or a sample in which some people demographically who are affected by the statistic you are trying to measure are not properly reached out to. So Nate Cohn continues on to say, and he goes, it's hard to measure non-response bias. After all, we couldn't reach these demographically similar votes, but one measure I track from time to time is the proportion of Democrats or Republicans who responded to a survey after considering other factors. Then he later goes on to say, across these final polls, white Democrats were 16% likelier to respond than white Republicans. And then he says that's a larger disparity than our earlier polls this year, and it's not much better than our final polls in 2020, even with the pandemic over. It raises the possibility that the polls could underestimate Mr. Trump yet again. So that kind of just sticks out like a sore thumb, and I don't think many people are talking about it. CNN's pollsters and anchors, they're talking mostly about how the country, the incumbent party doesn't typically win the election when most people think that the country is going in the wrong direction. But to me personally, I don't think that's the best indicator. I think people who are voting for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are both inclined to say, yeah, the country's not going in the right direction. But that's an interesting statistic. But I think this statistic and this observation to me most is very telling. And, obviously this is not 100% concrete. It just raises the possibility, makes it more likely. The fact that, it's just one of those things that, I guess it kind of makes sense that if you were to logically analyze it, the fact that Republicans tend to vote on election day, Democrats prefer absentee ballots. Some, super smart political scientists can explain that one for me, but I don't think the reasons why really matter. What matters most is the fact that, we're coming back with these early voting numbers and Republicans are exceeding expectations. But then the question becomes, do we have a lot of people switching from in-person voters to, early voters, or are those early voters just showing up, and that the fact that they didn't show up in 2020? That's another big question. Once I have that question answered, then I'll have a more concrete answer to say whether or not I think Donald Trump will win. But that's besides the point. The time you are watching this, the election will be tomorrow. And just because we're seeing early record numbers of voting in the early voting process, I predict that we will get our winner early morning Wednesday, so around 3 to 4 a.m., possibly even 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But yeah, I'm not much people are talking about how, the polls are, you can make the case that the polls are not as accurate as one may seem. And definitely they're not accurate in the sense that they're picking up Democrats more than they are picking up Republicans, which is, happened time and time again with Mr. Trump. So, if I were a betting man, I don't know. I wouldn't. I don't want to give you guys financial advice. Do I think Kamala Harris is still in position to win? Yes. But the paths for her are much more intricate. She's hell bent on Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which good numbers are coming out. And in terms of the betting markets, which have always predicted the president in terms of who's has a higher chance, with the exception of 2016, of course. She's been gaining numbers recently, but in my opinion, I just think that's a correction. So I think Trump is up, as of making this video, Trump is up in the betting markets at about 54% to Kamala Harris's 45%. So with that being said, polls will be polls. Don't get tangled up too much in the numbers per se, but the fact that, they're still trying, it's still a very hard time for, the New York Times A-grade pollsters to, account for these non-response biases of, having white Democrats more likely to respond than white Republicans is very concerning if you're in the Kamala Harris camp. And yeah, with that being said, I hope you enjoy your election day tomorrow, and may the best man or woman win. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy your day, and I'll see you tomorrow.